Okay. I think we're going to start the lecture, so if you please take a seat. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Okay, welcome to today's HafenCity lecture. Our topic today is alternative schools, and this lecture is happening in the framework of our interdisciplinary seminar, Testing University. Throughout the semester, we invite interdisciplinary guests to discuss the university's possibilities in regards of social, political, and economical challenges we are facing today. Today, we're going to start our lecture with Beatriz Colomina from the Princeton University, and we proceed with Anna Maria Meister, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Technical University in Munich. And she's a former member of the PhD students team at the Princeton University. So that's how Beatriz Colomina and Anna Maria Meister work together on the collaborative research project Radical Pedagogies that is highlighting experiments in architectural education worldwide throughout the post-World War II years. Our third guest is Nina Gribat. She's professor for urban planning and design at the Technical University in Darmstadt, and she's the co-editor of the book Vergessene Schulen. The book is about the movement of 1968 and how independently organized seminars were changing the perception of how architecture education could look like. She contributed to Radical Pedagogies with 2 case studies from Germany, so we also see a connection there. Okay, the stage is yours. I think so. Should be working, but
it's not on, so I don't know whether I have to turn it off or not.
Welcher Nummer steht da drauf? What number is it?
3.
It's in 3.
Yeah, it's always the same.
Your thing.
Yeah, it's also not perfect.
Not perfect.
Vielleicht ist das, it's not on.
It's not on, that's what I thought, yeah. It cannot work if it's not on. Now it's working. Oh, no,
okay.
No. Okay,
perfect.
Thank you very much for inviting us to come here. We are super excited to talk to you about this project, particularly because we hear that you have been yourself engaged in some sort of contestation of your pedagogy or your building. And in many ways it's very interesting to us that we are in a period in which many of these questions are coming back to us. But in the case of radical pedagogies, it goes back to almost a decade that we started this research on radical pedagogies. It has been a multi-year collaborative research project, which I have been leading with a group of PhD students from Princeton. Most of them already graduated, like Anna Maria Meister, and others about to graduate, in which we have done archival work, oral histories, lectures, workshops with protagonists and scholars from the period of the radical pedagogies that changed completely education. So the organizing paradigm for me is collaborative work in which the distinctions between the teacher and student between scholars and protagonists is somehow blurred. In fact, it's interesting to see that the protagonists of this period tended to be themselves teachers and activists. What you see right now in the picture is Giancarlo De Carlo, who of course was leading one of these radical pedagogist examples, the ILAUD, the Institute in Urbino. But you see him here surrounded by students that are occupying the Triennale of Venice that he's directing. And if you look at the picture, perhaps you think, oh, he's the straight guy with the suit and the tie, and the students are the revolutionary group. But in fact, it's much more complicated than that, because Giancarlo De Carlo was an anarchist, and he himself had been encouraging his students to protest, to engage, and the fact that he is outside engaging with the students already speaks to you, speaks to us to this situation in which he's interested to know why they want to close the Triennale, etc. Now, on the other hand, you may have seen in the background of the poster of this lecture a picture that is much more recent. This is 2010, and we are talking about the protest precisely against university reforms. I suppose it's the Bologna program that there were a lot of protests all over Europe. And you can see the students marching in the streets of Rome in a kind of performative act in which they are using seals against the police that are reproducing covers of important books, as you can see there. So in many ways, this scene for us captures this intersection between protest and education and Italian design, because actually it's quite beautiful, no? So they can never, even in the middle of protest, the Italians cannot help themselves. They have to make it look designy, right? And with these brightly colored seals in a kind of manifesto. So pedagogy becomes a protest. And what is interesting for us is that, of course, in this image is that what I was saying before, that this kind of civilian protest at all levels is coming back to us, and it's worth in that sense to think about radical pedagogy is not as something from the past, but also something totally relevant to our times as well. So this is actually to reflect on this is the Triennale occupata, so finally the students occupy the Triennale, but I also wanted to point out that many of the protagonists of this period, as I was saying before, were teachers and were activists, and it's not just Giancarlo De Carlo, but here you have the group of Global Tools, for example, in Florence, or so they are teachers and they are activists, right? Or you have the group of Farm in the United States, all kinds of protests, ecological protests, political protests, which they are performance. As you know, one of the members of Farm was an architect, or political protest in a more theoretical vein, for example, with Manfredo Tafuri, who was a communist and actively engaged in politics, and it completely revolutionized the way we understand theory. So it could be a very kind of performative way, and it could also be in the form of books. All these protests are taking place. In terms of my own teaching, I wanted to present also this radical pedagogies project as part of an initiative on my side, on the side of us at Princeton, to change architectural education. So the project is in that sense part of a series of experiments that I have been doing since the year 2000 with the idea of finding a new form of pedagogical model for the PhD program precisely, which you usually think in terms of the isolated scholar working in the libraries and how pale and isolated from the rest of the world. So in that sense, from the year 2000, I started this series of experiments in which you take students of the PhD program in their first year and work collaboratively with them on a topic. And the first topic was Cold War hothouses. At that time, I was working on post-war America, and it turned it into a book in which all these different students presented an essay. So that was the most simple form of collaboration. Another one was the discipline building, which turned into which was basically a history of the PhD program in architecture, and it turned into a conference in which all the protagonists of the beginnings of PhD in architecture in the United States were present. So you see people like Peter Eisman or Tony Bigler, or people that started, or Denise Scott Brown, that started the theory in the United States, but also the new generation of people like Mark Jarsenbeck or Michael Hayes, of myself, that were running PhD programs at that time. So the whole question was the rise of architectural history and theory in the 70s, coinciding precisely with the radical moment in architecture. The next project you may know is also even in the book that is going around from Nina and others, where they interviewed me about this project, which was about little magazines of the 60s and 70s, and it became an exhibition in the storefront for art and architecture in New York. So for years we went around doing research in these radical magazines. In many ways this project is very related to the Radical Pedagogies project, and not only we collected this, but we did this exhibition in the storefront for art and architecture. We did everything, the installation, the design, etc. And invited, it is New York, so it's easy, all the protagonists of these magazines that were still around, the whole group of oppositions, for example. You can see it's a kind of a full standing only room. Every night we had events with the group around the magazine October, with Rosalind Krauss and Yvan Bois, etc., or the London underground magazines, because in New York it's a bit like a train station. If you stay put, then everybody comes around you at a certain point. So it was easy. But from New York, we went to Canada, where we presented the exhibition in the CCA and incorporated other magazines. And then from there to Documenta 12 in Kassel, and to the AA in London. And again, multiple events organized. This is the whole group of Archigram around this question. So you keep collecting oral histories and incorporating into the project. And this was crucial because a whole generation was about to disappear. I mean, many of these people die in the meantime. This is, of course, Claude Parent, who died recently. Or here is Hans Colin, who is no longer with us. So we were catching a generation about to disappear and inquiring about these radical magazines that were produced during this period. This is Oslo. This is Barcelona, actually. This is Oslo. I'm making it very fast. Finally, everybody was asking us all the time, where is the book? Where is the book? So finally, we put together this kind of door stopper of a book. And the moment we finished the book, then the whole of Latin America started asking for the exhibition, and also in Japan, etc. So it went to Santiago de Chile and to Bogota, etc. So the project has another life, right? Radical Pedagogies, likewise, like Clip Stanford, builds on this kind of research, because it was obvious to us during this moment that many of these little radical magazines were connected to schools, and that these schools were really transforming themselves. So from there we went into Radical Pedagogies, and it became also an exhibition, which I found a very, very interesting way of doing research that manifests itself in so you don't separate architecture students from their first love, which is actually architecture in some ways, right? And an exhibition is a way in which you can bring all these talents of design and research together. So this is in Lisbon, where we did the first exhibition of radical pedagogy is a very simple exhibition in an abandoned school for the Triennale of Lisbon. And here we are in this installation, and also we have talks in the middle of the street, and all of this. And then somebody from the OMA had seen the exhibition in Lisbon and invited us to bring it to the Venice Biennale, where they were given this big wall in the Arsenale, and we put together this exhibition, this big wall with all the case studies and all the documents. I see that some of the pages you have printed here that you could pick up, all the case studies, right? And what was fascinating to us is that during the Biennale it became like a library. A lot of people came to do research in the Biennale, and according to the guards, people will spend their entire days because there were so many books and so many documents. And this is something that is very important to us about these exhibitions, Clip, Stand, Fall, and Radical Pedagogy, is that they become an archive, a live archive in which you keep accumulating material, and it's an archive that moves from place to place and learns from the people. So, for example, when we went to Chile, we discovered a lot of magazines that we have never heard about in the United States, that they are not in libraries, but the scholars in Chile help us to find out. Or when we went to Bogota, the same. When we went to Brazil. So all this, it becomes an archive that grows, an archive that becomes an interactive archive that reacts to people and incorporates their reactions. A lot of oral histories in all these places, right? In which we interview people that did these magazines, and then the interview becomes part of these archives. So this is, I'm saying it very fast, to give you a context in which this radical pedagogy is happening still today. In Venice, we were very happy to have a prize from the jury of the Venice Biennale, and this is all the team that came up on the stage to receive the prize. So this was the original set of case studies, and you can see that initially most of the cases are in the United States or in Europe. I mean, some are in Germany, the Hochschule in Ulm is here, or Freie Otto is here, there's some Italians here, and some Americans, whether it's, I don't know, Cornell or the Media Lab or the AA, etc., etc. It's interesting that after Venice, we were invited to Warsaw in Poland by the Museum of Modern Art that had discovered that we have done this in Venice, and we kept expanding. And it was very interesting to work with the people in Warsaw to expand into all these cases of radical pedagogy that have happened behind the Iron Curtain and that we had no idea. Of course, there are some cases that we know a little bit, like Oscar Hansen and so on. But with the help of scholars from Warsaw, we could collaborate with them and discover all these interesting cases. Also, as you can see in the black crosses, all these new cases that were added, and also these ones were mostly new in New Zealand and Australia. As the project started to gain force, many people wrote to us. We had a website. You can see in the website, you printed these pages. So in the website, people start writing emails to us. You know, did you know about this little school outside Buenos Aires, which when the junta had kind of fired all these professors, they got together and we thought, no, we didn't know about that. Okay, will you like to write the case? And they say, yes, I'd love to write the case. And then we started collaborating from this group of people in Princeton, which were like 10 PhD students and myself, to almost 100 people now globally that have written cases anywhere from Africa to Australia, New Zealand, etc. Many of them come to us through the website. So in that sense, it has become like a collaborative project that completely transcends the boundaries of where it was originated. So for us, that's a very interesting aspect of this project. The key point, I suppose, of the radical pedagogies project is that pedagogical experiments play a crucial role in shaping architectural discourse and practice in the second half of the 20th century. Here you have, for example, and this is globally, so it's not just what you know, the AEA or Cooper Union or all these experiments in different places, but you have here Valparaiso in Chile, doing all these experiments in the beach, or you have the polyart bus in London taking students from school to school, trying to transcend the limitations of the institution and the building, or you have the IMSS in India establishing or helping to establish the School of Design in Ahmedabad, or you have Negroponte and the Machine Group at MIT, and we will go into more detail into these cases. Actually, Ana Maria will go into more detail. But the hypothesis of our research is that these experiments can be understood as radical architectural practices in their own right. They are radical in the literal meaning of the Latin word radix, which is radice in Italian, right? Which is something actually belonging or relating to the root, to the basis of foundations. So radical pedagogies, what they do is actually shake foundations, disturb assumptions rather than disseminate them. So they go back to the roots of architecture to challenge. And this challenge to normative thinking was, of course, a major force in the post-war field in architecture that has been surprisingly neglected for decades until we started this massive research. Now, the background of all of this it may also resonate to many of you with today's, because, of course, this was a time of collective defiance and protest against all kinds of authorities, of institutions, bureaucratic and capitalist structures. You have, for example, here in the AD magazines, this is the kind of articles that you find in architectural magazines at that time. No, this is the last building of the last architect, but insurrection, cities and insurrection, for example. Posters of the May 68 revolt are designed in many cases by students. They call the Beaux-Arts in Paris with all the statues on the ground. Incredible protest. In the little magazines, you see how the students are part of the magazine. In Utopie, even Casabella, which you consider a kind of professional magazine, during this period dedicates much more space to the protest than to traditional architectural design. And it's not just 68, but every kind of dimension of society and every dimension of architecture is contested. You have the squatters protest in architectural design of Prague, 1968, in Casabella, of all places. Of course, all the students protest. The Triennale Occupata is in all the Italian magazines. You have all these images of destruction. And then the interesting thing is the Giancarlo De Carlo, who was the one that had organized the Triennale, and his Triennale is kind of demolished by the students, but he immediately kind of incorporates it into his discourse. And the next thing we have is the protest of the young as an exhibition, precisely in Milan in 68. So the revolt is easily kind of assimilated and turned into a presentation. But it's not just Italy or Paris alone. Avery at Columbia University is on strike, as you can see here. Yale University, the building was burned down allegedly by students. There were the Black Panther group trials were happening precisely in about the Black Panther group, right? African American protesting the police violence. I mean, very much resonating again with our times, with Black Lives Matter and the strong kind of demonstrations in our times against police brutality, etc. We are still in the same situation, right? So, but here you have the students of architecture who burned the building and put a banner on the building, "Free the Panthers," right? And here you have them in the streets protesting the trials, etc. But it's again not just Europe versus the United States, but it's protest in Valparaiso, honor the people fallen for the university. So all these people that were killed in Mexico, in all these protests, and you can see these students. And the further or the bigger background is, of course, the Cold War and the Vietnam War and the space program that are also very much part of what is in the background of this group. And all these domestic products, like Tupperware, or all these consumable plastics and all these objects of mass-produced desire. So all of a sudden, utopian technological prophecies in science fiction were realized in this brave new world of computation, gadgets, and space ships, and architecture obviously was not impervious to such shift, whether in high-tech proposals or informalist. Now we talk a lot about the informal housing, etc. But it's interesting, I'm almost there. That's why I'm running so much. The informal is already a topic which is super interesting. The slums is already a very, very interesting. I mean, probably these people in KTH, Alfredo Brillenburg, they think they invented the informal, what is it called? The informal housing. But it was actually already very much part of there was also the protest against ecological protest. Look, this is the cover of Domus magazine. It's a professional magazine, Earth, Help. So this is where architects are in this particular moment. So while some forms of radical practice celebrated architecture's integration in a larger cultural milieu, whether it's this or the plastics or the ecological, others somehow retreated to kind of an investigation of, so it's another form of radicality to deny that all of this is happening and go to the roots of architecture. So these people interested in the 9 Square project, for example, the group around Hamburg, etc., they are also radicals in our way, in the sense of going back to the roots of what architecture is in this kind of formalist approach. So, but they have in common a shared understanding that a new modus operandi, a new way of working for the discipline could only be created if traditional ways of teaching and of educating were questioned, destabilized, undermined, or even destroyed, right? So all this, they all have in common, even the most apparently conservative ones. Education became a vehicle for these subversive actions, as you probably can already see, and this happens whether it's in Mexico or at the AA in London, where this is an architectural magazine by the students, architectural radical students and educators, right? And you have here Alvin Boyarsky, of course, who revolutionized teaching at the AA. But to make it even shorter, I'm just going to give you a quote of Renkulhas, who was a student at the AA in the 70s and somehow captures this climate of this moment when he writes, the scene, London Architectural Association, 1970-1972, a school abusing sex, drugs, and rock and roll, David Bowie howling at the bar, for a studio, write a book if you want, dance or piss your pants if you want, a structure or coach or HBAC, you know what HBAC is? Heating, ventilation, air condition, go to Switzerland, right? So anything practical, structures, heating, ventilation, go to Switzerland. But at the AA, you will do anything but a building. It's of course a bit more complicated because even if he says here 1972, that's not true. It's an interview that he did much more recently because for everything I have heard, he was very upset at the AA. His grandfather was an architect, a practicing architect. He arrived there thinking that he he was a journalist. He arrives there thinking he's going to learn how to do buildings and so, and finds that all these kids are doing just shit, and all these professors that are like nothing practical, right? So he was apparently very upset. But anyway, he turns it around later on. The term, perhaps a little word about the term, radical pedagogy, comes from Germano Celand, who called radical design in this cover. You see this cover of Casabella. This is very interesting too. Think about architectural magazines like Casabella, and instead of having a new building or the face of an architect on the cover, you have a gorilla. Right? Okay, so something is happening, right? And radical design. And radical design is this group of, this menagerie of groups, basically, of Italian architects and publication between the 60s and the 70s, including Superstudio, Archizum, UFO, 999, Global Tools, etc., that emerged precisely during this period, and he calls radical design. Well, what all we are saying is that there was a parallel subversion in education, and it was not just limited to Italy. And here is Tafuri. By the way, he considered all these people in Florence not radicals at all. He considered this will be Hilbersheimer and going back to this moment. Okay, so what do we have? I don't have any time left or nothing time? No time. Maybe you can go into the oxymoron. Is radical pedagogy an oxymoron? Is one of the questions that we have, but perhaps it's not so important. You can see all these different things that are happening, from formal meetings to conferences in Ulm, at Princeton University, dinners. Dinners are very important. Greek parties, meetings in the grass, and retalking, etc. For me, a very important point is that this radical pedagogy established in a way a new mode of collaborative research, a model that actually in many ways resonates with the latest thinking about research in the science today, with the rise of collaborative think tanks, crowdsourcing of research, etc. This mode of collaborative research that was incubated in the 60s and 70s has been a kind of model for thinking of the PhD program, in that sense of getting away from the authority and more into this more collaborative way, which actually emerged from this period. So I leave it there, and we'll leave other questions for discussion, and then maybe Ana Maria can explain a little bit more in detail some of these cases. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. Ana Maria Meister is now going to have her presentation, and then we have 10 minutes for discussion. And then we will proceed with Nina Gribat in the end.
I have a little bit of a cold, which I guess is common these days, so we'll see how and if I make it. And I'm gonna take over from Beatriz directly. And I'll focus on. You have this. Okay. Is it now working? Okay. Yeah. So after Beatriz now gave you an idea. This is not cooperating well with my glasses. Idea of the project and the stakes overall. I will focus on questions of radicality in relation to institutions of education, which I guess is also part of what's been discussed here. So maybe to begin, we can ask, like Beatriz just did, whether radical pedagogies is an oxymoron to start with. And that includes the question whether the institution of education can be radical since it's institutionalized. So it's important to note that the case studies we look at in this project were not a homogeneous set of approaches, just the opposite. Some were contradictory even within themselves. So some of these cases of radicalism were located in the change of format of teaching, some in the distribution of power, others in the location. So there was a lot of different levels of radicalism or ranges. But radicalism, as Beatriz explained, is redefining. They were all trying to redefine the discipline from its root. And all of them had to or wanted to negotiate this kind of redefinition in relation to existing or new forms of institutionality. So I will focus on a few case studies here. Some might be familiar to you, some maybe a little less so, to investigate some of these relations between radicalism and pedagogy and the institutionality of education. But we can discuss more in the question after. So the tension between the radical impetus of experiments in architectural pedagogy, as we've seen in these case studies, and the institutional framework of traditional academic platforms was manifested in different forms. So some educators that we'll talk about critiqued pedagogical institutions from within. Others tried to institutionalize radicalism itself, and yet others abolished institutions altogether. Architecture pedagogy, and more particularly the School of Architecture as an institution, served as an object of critique in itself. So in many cases, the battle between radicalism and institutionality was fought from the institutions in which pedagogy was housed and led to upheavals on different levels. Educators often claimed their independence, the educators in these cases, claimed their independence from the institution in which they operated, even if the degree of this independence might be debatable. Many of them exploited, subverted, or simply needed those institutions as contrast or as funding operations for their radical self-definition. The latter was the case in the question of the global tools, a case study that Beatriz mentioned that Federica Vannucchi is writing about. A small group of architects operating in Italy during the period of the early 70s. And as we've heard, the protagonists included Archisum, Casabella, Rassegna editorial group, Riccardo Delisi, and a lot of Super Studio, UFO, Sigurat, amongst others. They defined themselves as a counter school of architecture, or as they also called themselves, a non-school. But at the same time, it's important to note, and they set up a set of laboratories between Milan and Florence, meetings held in the countryside, they did educational trips, seminars, but it's important to note that most of these installations, performances, that a lot of their teaching, even though very different in content, so this is Adolfo Natalini talking about bones, took place in a very traditional institutional settings, without which these wouldn't have been possible at all. And also if we regard magazines as institutions, they also relied heavily on the publication and the funding of Casabella and Rassegna, amongst others. So we can ask as one question, and there will be a few questions along the talk that we can collect and then discuss. How can conventional institutions host and offer sites for radical experiments? As we've heard, the period of the 60s and 70s should not be confused with a homogeneous set of political ideas, of course. A series of upheavals led by students and faculty, for example, at the School of Architecture in Valparaiso in Chile in 1967, a case study that Ignacio González Galán is writing about, seemingly shared some of the concerns close to the Paris student protests. But their demands in Chile were based on a legacy of 15 years before of destabilizing the traditional structures of the university through pedagogical practices that obliterated the boundaries between learning, working, and living. The experiment in this case was led by the Chilean architect Alberto Cruz, and the Argentinian poet Godofredo Yomi, started in 1952 and culminated in the 1967 revolts. Their project unfolded as a response to pedagogy of modern architecture in Latin America, as a reduction, as they saw it, to Western models and narratives of functionalism. And the specter of modernism, of course, is a big presence in a lot of these cases. The school tried to borrow the autonomy it saw or it projected to the arts like poetry or dance. They particularly questioned modern architecture's impetus to change the world, and they themselves turned this interest instead to a change of life, meaning their own life. So they performed in public, and their aim was to change their entire life, not just their architecture education. Through a series of so-called poetic acts, street performances, different trips and drifts, so they went to Paris, for example, and courses on the cultures of the body, the school aimed to overcome the instrumentalization of architecture that they located in other more traditional schools. By doing that, they did not only want to overcome the instrumentalization of architecture, but also of the institution. So what we see here is that it's not merely about the content of education that can be radical, but the forms of teaching and the platforms that can hold transformative powers as well. In response to the limitations set by higher university authorities, the school rose in a protest in 1967, as we've seen before. Though resonating in many demands with the contemporaneous reforms worldwide, the school rejected the political impetus of those and questioned the whole university system. So the Chile revolts aimed at transforming the university itself into a community and a form of life, prompting the foundation and the building, so they built it itself, of the so-called open city in Ritoque, where then teachers and students would live together, creating an alternative space for pedagogy and for life outside of school. So they were, as we've seen, at the beach. They literally and formally left the institution, going as far as they could. So one question we can ask, and what are the forms, and not just institutional forms, but the actual forms of radical pedagogy? Other similarly independent pedagogical groups explored the resources of well-established institutions to forge alternative educational practices that in turn challenge the fundamental notion of institution itself, or at least claim to do so. It's not always as easy to define. Consider, for example, the itinerant summer workshops that Beatriz talked about of the ELAUT by Giancarlo De Carlo, where the workshops were held in different cities and different universities using the existing infrastructure and network of institutions for their own subversive seminars. So at Venice or in Urbino, these kind of workshops were taking the existing institutions. In addition to changing roster of critics, the workshops participants were drawn from around a dozen architecture schools, so also the persons and the people came from existing infrastructures from different countries, and the kind of the ELAUT's mobility, autonomy, and diversity questioned the theoretical self-definition of the school and the academic institution as a stable body by kind of multiplying and reaching out into a multitude of these kind of institutions. Here we see the design studios. The Institute for Advanced Studies, for example, did it a little bit the other way around, a little more cheeky. They used the definition of the educational institute and pedagogical institution as a funding mechanism. So that's another way of kind of using the institution to then get funding for doing research and the things that you're trying to organize. So the very attempt to reject institutions positioned them in relationship with institutions, and they inevitably become a kind of institutional figure in their own definition, even in alternative structures. So this kind of relationship is, in a way, it seems like it's inseparable. There's always a kind of bind, and it can be closer, more subversive, or contradictory, or oppositional, but we have always this kind of radicalism and institutional definitions go together. And then, of course, we have cases. So the question is, where does an institution begin and end, and how does this negotiate? And then, of course, we have cases that are radical in a certain form, but are hyper-institutional. For example, the School of Ulm, the School of Design in Ulm. Here, Max Bill and Otto Eiche, and later Thomas Maldonado, they went off the grid in a certain way. They left, you see in the background, the city of Ulm. They left, they went up the hill, they did their own program. Some call it the Monastery of Design. But at the same time, you see the building, it's a very Swiss design. They went into the grid even more. The concept of the good design that was propagated at the school had its roots also in a kind of Swiss ethics or formal ethics from the Swiss Werkbund exhibitions, the good form, that Max Bill then brought to the school. The belief that good objects, when mass-produced and distributed, would make for better people was driven by a deeply humanist conviction at the school, performed through modernist functionalism. So expanding the notion of the Bauhaus, of the architect as the center of the education, pedagogues at the school in Ulm made no distinction, neither aesthetically nor methodologically, between designing buildings and designing teacups, ultimately leading to a design of the process itself rather than the final object. This process became one of optimization, moving the focus from aesthetics in the school's earlier years to design as a mode of control over production. On the one hand, interested in technological developments, cybernetics, this is what the school is mostly famous for, and material technologies, the HFG also brought a massive number of guest lecturers. So they have, over the course of their existence, they have hundreds of people coming through the school teaching. And they have ranging in discipline from mathematics to philosophy to sociology to authors, all sorts of disciplines. Theory and practice in this school were deemed equally essential to the education of a new designer. And yet, this new designer was educated in a heavily institutionalized structure. The process of self-reflection, change, and critique was supposedly built into the system of the school itself. And you see, if you go through the archive, for example, they have meetings upon meetings and then protocols of the meetings and copies of the protocols of the meetings that get distributed and then written statements reacting to these kind of protocols, and then those get copied again and circulated. So it's a huge paper trail that gets created. So there's here, you could say in a way that radicality as such, or the wish for radicality was institutionalized, or rather institutionality was radicalized. So this can bring a question that we could talk about, whether a school can institutionalize critique, whether you can build critique into the mode of teaching itself. The rethinking of structures, it was not restricted to institutional processes or curricula in some of these experiments that we looked at, but found its negotiation also in the very materialization of schools as buildings, campuses sometimes, or their negation. So the building of the school, and we heard already from a few people some criticism about this building, but then at the same time, if you give architects any kind of building, there will be protests. The question of the building as school is one of the ones that we can look at as an institution as well. So at the HFG, the building by Max Bill was a concrete, and literally a concrete manifestation of the functionalist conviction of its founders, presenting the building, as I said, as a monastery of design. They had rules for what you could put in your room. You couldn't put up art. You couldn't listen to. You couldn't listen to rock and roll. Only jazz, or classic, of course. So there were certain rules for this kind of sparse mindset. Other experiments that we look at try to undo the central institution of teaching through the architecture itself. So, for example, in the case of the decentralized university in Urbino by Giancarlo De Carlo, a case study that Britt Eversole is writing about, is one example where the attempt of the building as this kind of enclosed world to instill a certain mindset was moved and decentralized in a different mindset. And then you have, of course, Cedric Price's ideas of academic infrastructure as a different kind of mobile set of parts. And for example, the competition by Candelis Joseph Woods for the Free University in Berlin, where the building itself becomes a kind of decentralized a project trying to teach something to the student. Then, as we've heard before, briefly, the polyarch bus, for example, tries to work against the building by picking students up from one school and dropping them off at another, probing the foundation and the foundation of institutional continuity by simply exchanging parts of the population. So here, not the building was changed, but the people were exchanged. In some other cases, as we've seen, the academic building was left behind altogether, undoing its role as pedagogue and pedagogical symbol, like in Valparaiso, where, at least for a certain period, there's no building of architecture, of an architecture school altogether. There's gatherings, but no buildings. This subversive use of non-architecture as alternative site for pedagogy pushed the understanding of a school as material manifestation beyond its architecture. So it expanded the role of the building as teacher to that of the environment teaching the architect. So we can ask, how can a building, a city, or the environment be a school as an institution? The attempt to find radical approaches at the time, meaning to address questions of societal, political, or disciplinary importance at their root, radically, was not limited to the discipline itself. Architectural education was challenged and drawn upon, seen as potential, from the outside by professionals and intellectuals from other fields. Design pedagogy was not only seen as symptomatic of larger issues, but had also become the field for a rethinking of pedagogy at large. So, for example, the 1972 Symposium de Universitas project, organized by Emilio Ambas at MoMA, a case study that Felicity Scott is writing about, is an example of these speculations. In a series of meetings, roundtables and texts, historians, writers, artists, philosophers, scientists, architects, and educators offered proposals for a design education in a post-technological society. The list of guests to the symposium included, amongst others, Denise Scott Brown, Umberto Eco, Jean Baudrillard, Hannah Arendt, Octavio Paz, Susanne Keller, Henri Lefebvre, György Kepes, and Csilló Dorfles, and the list goes on. Rather than offering explicitly anti-institutional alternatives, Ambas sought to devise a new framework that he defined as, quote, a new type of institution centered around the task of evaluating and designing the man-made milieu, end quote. So here we see that architectural education was not just seen as a key challenge and not just seen as a problem or as something to work from within the discipline, but as a point of entry for a reimagining of the future and the future at large. These kind of projects showed a shared belief across disciplines that design education could address important social and political issues. And that's one of the beliefs that a lot of these experiments share and that we feel is today at least not as grounded in society anymore. But of course, other institutions are at play in these investigations as well. Societal institutions, such as patriarchal structures built into the educational system, for example, became sites of transformational architectural pedagogies. The experimental summer programs of the Women's School of Planning and Architecture, established in 1974, a case study by Andrea Merritt, gathered different feminist sensibilities in the US. Rather than merely opening a space for women within the profession, it rehearsed collaborative and non-hierarchical structures against the model of male-dominated institutions. At UC Berkeley, the collaboration between the Center of Independent Living, a case study by Kathleen James Chakraborty, the collaboration between the Center of Independent Living and the College of Environmental Design in the 1970s led to the introduction of physical accessibility as a topic of architectural education inside the classroom and the studio. the ambition to give equal access to diversely abled bodies within the built environment was a spatial analog of a more general concern with the inclusion of the ever-new voices and sensibilities within the university. And in fact, this collaboration can't be detached from the heated political debates, protests, and strikes that were taking place on campus at the time in Berkeley, starting with the free speech movement in 1964. So here, political action took shape as a series of physical interventions on the Berkeley campus, such as curb cuts to form accessibility ramps. Policy changes that ensued these events culminated into the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Acts in 1990. So here, the protest of the reshaping of the built environment becomes a whole different policy for a whole society. The book project that we're working on now extends the geographical and topical reach of the previous selection of case studies even further. So here we have a school in Baghdad trying to negotiate the modernist architecture with traditional forms, or a school in Kumasi in Ghana training architects for the projected African decade, for example. So the case studies that we include and that we will include in the book include significant explorations which remain largely unknown still within the discipline, and they address urgent questions of, for example, gender, as I talked about, race, but also the work with indigenous communities, and a range of political questions that are so pressing again. This is again the school in Kumasi. So, and here we see again in red the new cases that we keep adding, and this is not a finite list. We're still adding cases that come to us that feel relevant for the further exploration. So what we see across these cases is that radicality, there's not one definition of radicalism or radicality, but that radicality depends on context, of course, and it can take many shapes. It can be about the form, about the methodology. It can be an exercise in resistance. It can be an exercise in subversion, but it can also be a heightening, a hyper-institutional embodiment of one certain aspect of the institution that you're occupying. So what is radical depends on, of course, on the where and the when and in which institution, and there's no given scale or given effect that makes something radical or not. Success, of course, in that line of work is relative. So the HafG, for example, closed its doors in 1968, just when the student revolts in Europe started gaining traction after only 15 years. And most of our experiments that we look at are short-lived and then either get closed or were absorbed by other institutions. But then, of course, the question is, if you get absorbed by another institution, that could count as success as well, because then part of that legacy might move the mainstream into the direction you tried to change all along. So even the failure becomes part of the kind of radical impetus, and what they all share, and why we talk about them and why we look at them is the impact they had, and the fact that they treated architectural education as a site for experimentation. So as some of the questions that we might want to discuss afterwards, because the questions that these experiments share, both the societal questions, the political questions, and the disciplinary questions haven't gone away. I mean, we were faced with these in a crisis mode, if ever there was one. So, and any analysis, of course, of these kind of past events or historical precedents is not an attempt to go back in a sentimental mode and say, oh my God, look at these amazing things, but it's a question of how they operated, and to see if they can offer points of entry to a discussion of the future of architectural pedagogy and education, especially in a landscape of education where there's a lot of homogenization going on, a professionalization, a kind of discourse centering around technical innovation and sustainability. So there's a kind of homogenization of concerns that I think that we think can be broken up. So the understanding that these experiments share, that we want to revitalize, I guess, and that we would like to discuss with you is the question of the education of the architect as a projective endeavor, that you're not trying to run after a status quo or trying to run after a certain innovation in another field, but that you try to see architecture pedagogy as a kind of site for radical experimentation to change things in different registers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for both of these great presentations. We have 10 minutes now, so if somebody wants to...
internet and social media has...
Thank you very much. We can now proceed to Nina Gribat, and in the end we can have a big discussion with everybody involved and all the other questions can be asked.
Ich habe es jetzt wieder angemacht. Wo haben wir die PDF?
Wir müssen erstmal Wo ist denn das?
Du musst einfach gleich nochmal suchen. Achso, ist schon offen?
Ja.
Hast du es auch
Wo ist denn diese
gelegt?
Bar? Ich hab's irgendwie. Einigermaßen aus. Ah, jetzt ist es doch da. Okay. Ja. Hello everyone. I'm really happy to be here and to talk about our project. It's called Forgotten Schools, Architecture Education Between Reform and Revolt around 1968. It's also a fairly long-term project, like we started in 2011 at the University of Stuttgart. And back then it was also meant to just address Stuttgart, because what we noticed is that the school had a particular way in remembering its own history. And it was a way of remembering the history that basically eclipsed the extremely exciting moment between 65 maybe and 75. So the moment when you had more people engaging in determining what architecture education was supposed to be, etc., etc. Since it was a fairly long-term project, we also expanded beyond Stuttgart and took into consideration Berlin. And what I'm going to talk about is basically two moments of questioning like the roles of architecture, like a moment in which people voted for a rationalization of architecture, for scientific methods, interdisciplinarity, and were very much convinced that industrialization of planning and building could solve any kind of social problems. So this was one moment, and then the other moment is the moment of politicization, of critique of urban renewal, critique of, say, gender relations, critique of hierarchies at the university system, etc. And it was a moment where participation was voted for, community planning, counter planning, etc. And both moments kind of succeeded each other at both universities, but they were also slightly intermingled, so you can't really separate them very easily. So what I'm presenting here is a little bit of a kind of artificial separation between the two, but I think it's a quite useful separation because it basically takes apart two forms of critique of the role of, say, traditional architecture, or the idea that design is aesthetics purely. What I'm also going to talk about briefly is alternative practices, self-organized teaching, and the question of university reform, because the moments we looked at is basically questioning architecture from within an institution and how that changed. And then as a little excursion, the question, what's happening today? Because when we started the project, we were kind of a little bit frustrated with having to go through reform movement after reform movement because of Bologna and because of all sorts of changing university politics, but the complete lack of student involvement in any of these reforms. So we had a very kind of stagnant moment, and I think this moment has changed slightly. So I'm quite interested in debating on this because you are also right now involved in this protest. So rationalization was, and the idea that you could basically develop scientific ideas, scientific methods for design, came along with all sorts of new tools, like this Zwicky box, for instance, where you would really find rational ways of deciding what kind of a door is the best solution for which kind of building in which conditions. And you could go through all possibilities, from having a door of plastic, wood, etc., all sorts of materials. And of course, this was immensely complicated in a time where you didn't even have computer programs. So you do this all by hand. You can find wonderful examples of hand-drawn maps and tables that go into an incredible amount of detail, and it's wonderful to hear people talk about how they developed these ways of finding a rational way of making a decision. So not to decide from your stomach or from somewhere else, but to really find a good way of doing it. And I mean, I think it's a quite interesting experiment when you really think about the amount of decisions that you take within a design process to really have the ambition to found those on scientific methods. What was also happening is this idea that we need to understand our context that we work in. So this is a table that is called Vom Affen zum Mondkalb. It's wonderful in German. I can't really translate it. It's from the monkey to the moon calf. And it shows you the naked human, the human with clothes, the human with furniture, the human within its environment, and then with like all sorts of goods and services, and then it goes until the human in its kind of worldly surroundings, and then within space. And I think this whole idea that you could control or really even understand how all of this would really work together, I think this ambition is just really amazing. So this idea that you could really work through a completely functioning systems theory. And you find wonderful examples where all of this is in big tables again. And you also find quite humorous commentary of going through this immense effort in trying to understand your context. So this is a document, like a master's thesis of one of our protagonists in the book, and he basically, this is his conclusion, what you end up with a big green salad that starts eating you, because it's immensely difficult to really draw any kind of clear conclusions from all these exercises of finding proper scientific methods of designing. So all of this was happening a lot at the University of Stuttgart in the mid-60s. You find a lot of protagonists who were fascinated also by going to HFG Ulm, who went there for lectures, who visited lectures from Max Bense, even though they only understood half of them, never mind, like really fascinated by fields of knowledge that had absolutely nothing to do with architecture. And what they did at the same time was also to engage in very celebratory moments and these kind of moments of hedonistic, Dadaistic craziness. Like on the right, you see a picture of two mountains, and when you look a bit closer, it actually resembles two female breasts. And this is a digging experience of a whole week that architecture students did between the two buildings at Stuttgart University. And it was the in the weeks before the Carnival celebrations. So they had week-long processes of building up Carnival exhibitions to celebrate a crazy moment in their university career. So 1965, it was called Pop Arch. 1966, Matriarch, so this is Matriarch with the two breasts. And then 1987 was Rot Arch. On the red arc, you could only come with red hair. So everyone, thousands of people, because thousands of people came back then, had red hair. So they all colored their hair. It was immense moments of celebration. So all of this, like the rationalization and this complete hedonistic moment, went kind of hand in hand. You also have the proliferation of new forms of publication. Like this is a bi-weekly flyer publication, ARC Information, which the students published between November 67 and May 68. And that was basically to provide information what kind of lectures would happen where. So in between all these beautiful collages, you would find like information this Thursday, a student is reporting of his experience of going to XYZ, and then also books are involved in this, etc. So they would meet on a Wednesday and assemble these flyers. Most of you have probably seen this Arch Plus. Arch Plus was then also founded at the University of Stuttgart in amongst this whole movement of trying to rationalize architecture design at the time, but also finding a new reform. So they basically applied for the foundation of Arch Plus, like it was 2 lecturers and 2 students basically doing this, and then they managed to bring out a paper 2 years later, and this is kind of all in the same period of time. And this Arch Plus was meant to really provide information of a kind that was otherwise not available to the students at the time. So information about study reform, information about new forms of methods, new approaches to architecture. And when you look at the first issues of Arch Plus, they are completely written, just very sparse diagrams in it. Systems theory is addressed, and all sorts of reports from study movements. So quite interesting in how that all comes together. You also find like more copy-based pamphlets that inform students about critique on a technocratic study reform, on sorts of protocols, on new study plans, etc., etc. So you find tons of things in Stuttgart's archives that are marked with Arch+, so the additional, the new form of doing architecture. And at this time you also had the first moments of computerization, which also then provided the means of going much more into depth with these methods of scientifically doing design that I showed in the beginning. You could much better do a Zwicky box with a computer than on a piece of paper in the end. In Berlin, some of this movement was also happening, and mostly in form of the design seminars by Ungers, because Ungers at this time also completely believed that issues such as the housing crisis could be solved with industrialized means of production. So what they did is drawing up these immensely huge housing projects that were preconceived with prefabricated units and then assembled, like in this case, very nicely with a ship on a big bridge. You find all sorts of issues on this. So there's some kind of remnants between the scientific method, the rationalization and industrialization, which you can find at both schools. And of course, this had as a precondition tabula rasa. So this is a design exercise that the students did in TU Berlin, where you would basically get rid of all the existing housing stock that you still see on the map, and then build these hugely, or design these huge housing things that look like they landed with an UFO. Ungers was also a really interesting figure because he seemingly responded to the demands of the students for more theory. So in '67 he carried out an architecture theory symposium international. If you look through the list, like all the big names are basically came to TU Berlin. And then what happened is the students used this to protest, and they unfolded a huge poster. Most of you may have heard about it, and on the poster it said, "All houses are beautiful, stop building." So really putting into question this idea that you would still need to engage in the process of designing or constructing houses. After this, Ungers left pretty soon, and this is the moment where I now enter into the second part of the more politicized movements. Just a little bit of the context. In Berlin at the time, as most of you will be aware, there was a moment of huge urban renewal going on. The plans of building big highway intersections in the old city fabric. Demolitions were underway. At the same time, mass housing was being constructed in the peripheries. In the midst of this, students, again, with young architects and with some lecturers, organized the Diagnose exhibition, which was the first expression of a politicized movement within the Technical University of Berlin. And you can see already in the poster, the critique that they formulated was basically the interrelation between architects, speculators, the Senate, and the housing associations. So they critiqued the very context that they were operating in, and they critiqued also the kinds of tasks that they were presented with, like construction of mass housing, demolition of centrally located housing stock. They also critiqued the corruption in the context of housing, like how parties, housing companies, and administrations were basically intermingled. They critiqued the architecture competition system, and they also outlined at the the same time a new curriculum of urban planning on how to do it better, the Planer Flugschrift. So just to run through it, because we don't have that much time, the figure of the architect appears very central. Architects opposed to the residents, and they basically describe a huge abyss between both groups, and I think this is a pretty good example here. On the left, like some of you may know this, the architect poses for TV. This is how he builds for others, this is the mass housing, and this is how he lives for himself. He represents many, and this is taken from a publication that was published in the early 70s, and that also goes to the Märkisches Viertel mass housing district. Wohnst du sozial, hast du die Qual. So if you live in a social housing, you are basically struggling. Also from the diagnosis here, the competition practice, they basically went through the latest architecture competitions and looked who was commissioned, on which basis, and the main point is that free interdisciplinary planning groups basically got no commission from any kind of free architecture competition, and only 3% of the building jobs were determined by open public architecture competitions, whereas most of the jobs were given under the table to the well-known architects. So a strong moment of politicization also comes out in the planning curriculum that was set up, and the planning curriculum was only one of the manifestations of earlier working groups. For instance, as part of the critical university, completely self-organized teaching formats from 67 to 68. Mostly held in the social sciences and humanities, but only one working group was at the TU Berlin, and that was Architecture and Society. It was a self-organized teaching format, and the outcome of this can be found in this new curriculum and this whole write-up around it. At this time, students then also put a lot of these into practice. As I said, some of the professors had left the university. Hermkes retired, and Ungers left because he was so frustrated that students wouldn't get how great he was. So he left to the US. And this meant that a lot of resources and infrastructure was basically available, and that they could be taken over by students. A similar thing also happened at Stuttgart. I'm not going to talk about it, but this kind of taking over of available infrastructure, be it just rooms, a copy machine, etc., like lecturers that were suddenly available and that could become like allies in a self-organized teaching format. Like all of this was happening. And it's quite interesting that they try to organize it in a very interdisciplinary form. They also involved sociologists and political scientists. And it's a bit small, but this is a list of the reform seminars that was happening at the time, and you see that 360 participants were involved in more than 15 reform seminars. You also find this wonderful paper trail that you already talked about, so protocols of meetings, the full frustration of sitting in these meetings, reform proposals. All of this is basically not well researched yet, and I think it's a really wonderful source of really going through these self-organized forms. So on the right, this is one of the frustrating things. So one of the study reform groups went to Kreuzberg and got one of the corner shops and worked on informing the citizens of Kreuzberg about the impeding urban renewal. So basically them losing their house due to the planned demolition. They called themselves the Office for Urban Renewal and Social Work in Berlin-Kreuzberg. It was mainly architecture students and a few sociologists, and they went out there every day to try and agitate the citizens. A task that turned out much more complicated than they thought. This publication, Renovation for Whom, is a wonderful collection also to the different references that they had. So they were very interested in tenant struggles from the US, from the UK. They had examples from France and from all sorts of places all over Europe and beyond that they worked with, allied with. They were involved, like this is a flyer basically informing the tenants about the counter planning that the students wanted to do to basically prove that you could rehabilitate the building stock and that the tenants wouldn't need to have heightened rent because of it, and that you could basically do it yourself. Back to the university, because the students basically considered their own experiments as failed, but they went to the university to then also finish studying. And at the university, a huge university reform had taken place. This is where you find the old alma mater with all the people in their old costumes, basically going through this machine, and out comes like also the architect artist going through this machine, and out comes like social sciences, Bauplanung, and like all a new practice. So 68. In Kreuzberg, things also changed, and the students did some more research at the university about all this housing. Politicization took the form that it went into ever smaller groups that did a lot of infighting, and this is basically where I want to leave it. So just in conclusion, what were the effects? At the university, you would find a lot of new teaching formats that were established and that we take for granted nowadays. Group work, project and problem-based teaching and learning was introduced back then. Separate courses and degrees for architecture and planning, the foundation of new institutes, and a shift from elite education to mass education took place back then. So you would have a complete transformation of the university. Student numbers exploded, and I think we're at a moment in a process where things are changing fairly radically again. In professional practice, you also have a huge shift at this time. A lot of jobs were created in the administration, in planning departments and elsewhere. You have conservation as a completely new field that emerges, and a slow paradigm shift from urban renewal to careful urban renewal. And more generally, and I think that also came through the two previous presentations, this immensely lively debate with numerous publications, more so than actually finished projects or architecture projects that basically also ask us to look at our history slightly differently. That emerged. You had an interdisciplinary openness and also a curiosity to look beyond, which I think some of this might still be the case. And you had a lot of splintering political groups, a lot of infighting. But I think what's most important is the last point that I put here is the sense of agency to really shape your own education, even though you were merely a student. And I think that this sense of that we can change the situations that we are involved in, even if we may not be in the most powerful situation, that this is a quite interesting and inspiring moment, and that also makes, that I think could be reflected on today. And just as a small afterwards, nowadays we have protests again, also in Darmstadt. our students are protesting because they feel they are basically being compromised in terms of the education that they get, and the things they put out is like, oh, what kind of education do we get if there's no money in the pocket any longer? Like, this is the logo of TU Darmstadt. And they also took it to the streets. Wir sind hier, wir sind laut, weil man uns die Bildung klaut. We are loud because we are basically getting rid of our education. And I think that's a quite interesting moment, because here protests are taking place, in Darmstadt protests are taking place, but I think we are in a completely different moment again, and I think that makes it quite interesting to look back at some of the things, not so much with a sentimental eye, but also with a curious eye of what could happen now. Yeah, and this is what we are involved in right now, like a symposium we just held in December to really look at the legacy of reform and revolt and really reflect from our point in the current back to 68, also on a broader level, not just the two universities that we looked at. Yeah, thanks.